My name is Eleanor Thatcher. I'm 35 years old. On the morning of my wedding, my father stood in the doorway of the church I'd grown up in and told me he would not walk me down the aisle because my groom was, in his own words, not one of us. He told me to walk in alone and think hard about what I'd done. So I let go of his arm and I waited for the music. And when those doors finally opened, I was not alone. The man whose arm I took was someone my father hadn't laid eyes on in 30 years. What my father did in that doorway, in front of the whole town, is the reason he will spend the rest of his life explaining a name he spent 3 decades pretending he'd forgotten. And I never once raised my voice. Welcome back to Quiet Justice Stories. This is a channel for women who have learned that the quietest person in the room is usually the one holding the truth. If a story here ever puts words to something you carried by yourself, you are among friends. Leave a comment and be sure to subscribe. Let me take you back to the Tuesday I decided to tell my parents I was engaged. I was 35, living in Indianapolis, a little over 2 hours from the farm I grew up on. I left that farm at 18 with 1 suitcase and a half scholarship, and I paid for the rest of nursing school working night shifts at a nursing home. I do hospice now, which means I sit with people in the last rooms of their lives. You learn things in that work that nobody warns you about when you sign up. You learn what people regret. And almost no one ever regrets the truth they told. They regret the truth they swallowed, the apology never made, the door they let stay shut. Theo and I had been together 4 years by then. He was a large animal veterinarian, the kind of man who could talk a 1,000-pound steer down out of a blind panic and then come home and tear up at a phone commercial. On my refrigerator there was a photograph, soft and pale at the corners, of a man I called my uncle. People asked about him sometimes. Friends, Theo, the woman who cleaned for me. I never explained him. There was a tree in that photograph too, a young white oak by a gravel lane, staked against the wind, and I carried a memory of being small underneath it. A memory that didn't match a single story my family had ever told me. I figured telling my father I was getting married would be the hard part of all this. I was wrong about which part was hard. The drive out to Merrill County is flat and green and honest. Corn on one side, soybeans on the other. The grain elevator standing up over the little town like a church of its own. The Thatcher farmhouse sits at the end of a gravel lane like it has always been there. Because it nearly has. My family has farmed that ground since before my grandmother was born. The screen door on the back porch still has the same spring it had when I was a girl. It cracks open slow, a long, rusty complaint, and then it slaps shut hard, and the sound carries clear across the yard. I could find that sound in my sleep. It is the sound of who's coming in and who's being let out. My father, Carl, was at the kitchen table with the grain markets on the radio, the way he has been every morning of my life. My mother, Brenda, was at the stove, already smiling, the smile she wears when she's bracing for something. My brother, Dale, was out by the bins, which is mostly where he lives now. He'd taken out a second mortgage that spring to expand. Big plans. A new grain bin, a truck scale, another 40 acres he'd been wanting since high school. Across the section line, old Earl Hollis lifted a hand to me from his porch, the way he had 1,000 times before. He'd farmed beside us my whole life. My mother dried her hands on a dish towel and walked me right back out toward the truck before I'd hardly gotten my coat off. "Just don't bring up anything that'll upset your father," she said, low, like a warning passed between women. I hadn't said one single word yet. I brought Theo out the next Sunday for dinner. I told myself a shared meal was the fair way to do it. Let them meet the man, not the idea of the man, not whatever picture had already gotten ahead of us. My mother set out the good plates, the ones with the gold rims that only come down for holidays and funerals. My father shook Theo's hand the way you shake hands with a man selling something you've already decided not to buy. Dale talked weather and basis prices and would not quite let his eyes land on Theo's face. We were halfway through the roast when Dale's phone went off. One of his steers was down in the lot, bloated, in real trouble. Theo set his napkin beside his plate. "Mind if I take a look?" he said. He was out in that lot in his good shirt within the minute, sleeves rolled, hands shore. He found the blockage, talked Dale through relieving it, saved the animal, and never once made it sound like a rescue. He came back in smelling of the barn and washed up at the kitchen sink like a man who'd done it in that house 100 times. My mother watched him with something close to hope. My father watched all of it without a word. Then he speared a piece of roast and, without lifting his eyes from his plate, he said, "Where is he from exactly?" The room went quiet enough to hear the clock on the wall and the screen door breathing in the wind. That same week, Earl Hollis became my patient. 84 years old, congestive heart failure, the kind of slow goodbye I know how to keep gentle. Hospice came to him at his own place the way he wanted, in the bed by the window that looked out over the ground he'd worked for 60 years. The agency assigned me partly because I knew the family, and partly because I'm good at the hard ones. Earl had been the recorder's clerk down at the county seat for more than 30 years before he retired. The man who filed the deeds and the wills and all the quiet paperwork that decides, in the end, who owns what. He had a memory like a filing cabinet. The first afternoon, I changed his linens. He watched me a long time with those pale, watery eyes. "You're Carl's girl," he said. "You favor your grandmother. You favor Vera." I told him I'd take that as the compliment it was. He smiled, and then the smile drifted off somewhere I couldn't follow. "I knew this place when there were 2 brothers on it," he said. I asked him what he meant. He looked out the window at the long gold light lying across the fields. "Your grandmother never got what she asked for," he said. "Not at the end. And I had a hand in it." I figured it was the medicine talking, or an old man's mind wandering back through 60 years. It was neither. The wedding took shape the way weddings do, in small decisions that turn out to be large ones. I wanted it in the church I grew up in, the little white one off Route 9 with the pump organ and the cemetery out back, where my grandmother is buried under a stone that says, "Beloved Mother." My mother heard the plan and got that pinched look around her eyes. "Keep it small," she said. "Keep it calm. You know how your father is." I did know how my father is. I have always known. Out at the farm, Dale had other things on his mind. He'd decided the old white oak by the lane had to come down to make room for the new bin and the truck scale, a tree older than the both of us, standing right in the way, he said, like the tree had done it on purpose. I told him that tree wasn't anywhere near as old as he made it out to be. I told him somebody had planted it. I just couldn't bring back who. Dale shrugged the shrug of a man who didn't want to bring it back either. That night I lay awake in the city deciding something. I would ask my father to walk me down the aisle. Not because I expected him to say yes, but because I wanted to give him one clean chance to be the man I'd believed in when I was small. And I wanted to see with my own eyes what he'd choose to do with it. I called my cousin Renee that night, the way I always do when the ground feels uncertain under me. Renee and I grew up apart, on opposite sides of a silence I didn't even understand yet, and we found each other as grown women and never let go. Somewhere in there, she became the person who knows the true version of me, the one underneath the competent nurse who fixes everything for everyone. She listened to the whole plan, the church, the dress, the asking of my father. Then she said the quiet things she's allowed to say and nobody else is. "You sure you want him at the front of that church?" I said he was my father. She said that wasn't an answer. And she was right, and I let her be right. We didn't argue about it. We never argue. We just sat on the phone in 2 different kitchens, hers 2 counties away and mine in the city, and let the silence carry what we both already knew. After a while, Theo came in from the clinic, still in his coveralls, and kissed the top of my head and asked if I wanted tea. I said yes. I love a man who answers a woman's worry with a kettle instead of a speech. "You'll do the right thing," he told me, "whatever it turns out to be." I told myself I had time to think it through. I had 2 days. 2 days later, at the farmhouse table, my father set down his fork. It was the 4 of us and Theo when I asked him, plain and simple, the way my grandmother would have. "Dad, will you walk me down the aisle?" He didn't answer right off. He chewed. He swallowed. He set his fork down so it clicked against the rim of the plate. Then he looked at Theo, not at me. And when he gave his answer, "I won't stand up in front of that church for this." My mother's hands went still on the table. Dale found something fascinating in the bottom of his water glass. "He's a good man, Dad," I said. "You saw what he did out in that lot." And my father said the words I will hear for the rest of my life. "He's not one of us." The whole kitchen held its breath. Then he turned and looked at me directly, for the first time. "You want to go through with this? You go through with it without me. Walk yourself in and think hard about what you're doing to this family." Theo never moved, never flinched. He just slid his hand over mine under the edge of the table, warm and steady, the way you'd calm a frightened animal. I looked at my father, and the strangest calm came down over me. The calm of a thing you've been afraid of, finally happening in the daylight. "All right, Dad," I said. "Then I'll find someone who will." I had no idea yet who that someone would be. Behind me, the screen door chose that exact moment to swing up on its old spring and slap shut hard in the wind. By the time Theo and I reached the county line, my phone had started buzzing in the cup holder and wouldn't quit. It was the family group text, the one my mother started years ago for birthdays and harvest schedules, and now, apparently, for this. My aunt on my father's side, the loud one, wrote that I was breaking my father's heart on purpose, that I'd always had to make everything a production. Dale wrote that I was stirring up drama I couldn't take back, and that I ought to think about the rest of them for once. A cousin wrote a single word: "Wow." My mother wrote nothing in the group at all, which in my family is the loudest thing a person can do. And then she texted me alone. "Please don't make this worse." I didn't answer a single one of them. I learned a long time ago that you cannot win an argument with people who need you to be the villain of the story, because the moment you go quiet, they have to look at what they actually said. So I drove. Theo kept his eyes on the road and his hand on my knee, and let me be quiet for 40 miles. At a red light in Greenfield, with the phone still going off in the cup holder, I opened my contacts and scrolled down past my father, past Dale, past my mother, all the way to a name I hadn't dialed in months. The name was just 2 words: Uncle Eli. 2 days later, I drove to my uncle's place 2 counties over, where the chosen half of my family lives. Eli Thatcher is my father's older brother. He's 64 years old, with my grandmother's same soft gray eyes, and he runs a feed and seed business that half the farmers in his county lean on to get their crop in the ground. His wife, Loretta, met me at the door with flour on her hands and pulled me into a hug that smelled like a Sunday kitchen. Their daughter, my cousin Renee, was already at the table because, of course she was. Because this is where we both drive when something at home breaks. This is the family I go toward. I sat down in that warm kitchen, and I didn't ask my uncle for one thing yet. I just let myself be a person who is loved, with no fine print, no conditions, no list of who's allowed. After a while, Eli poured the coffee and looked at me across the rim of his cup. "Your grandmother used to hum in a kitchen just like this one," he said. "You remember her tune?" I told him I thought I did. I told him it lived somewhere under everything I knew about my family, faint, like a song coming through a wall in another room. He nodded slow. "She was humming it the last time I ever saw her," he said. "Right before your daddy and I stopped speaking. Right before all of it." He set his cup down careful. "There's a part of that you were never told, Eleanor." Here is the story I grew up on. The year was 1996, and I was 4 years old, so most of what I have is secondhand, sanded smooth by 20 years of retelling at holiday tables. My Uncle Eli married a woman named Loretta. Loretta was black. My grandmother, Vera, loved her on sight. My father did not. There were dinners that ended with chairs scraping back early, and a Christmas that simply didn't happen. And then, one spring, Eli was just gone. Off the farm, out of the family, his name folded up small and put away in a drawer nobody opened. The way my father told it, his brother had run off chasing a new life and turned his back on the old one. The way the aunts told it, Eli broke his mother's heart and put her in an early grave. Nobody ever told it from Eli's side of the fence, because Eli was never in the room to tell it. What I have of my own is thin and strange. I remember the white oak by the lane being newly planted, a skinny little thing tied to a stake. I remember a tall man lifting me up to see over the pasture fence, and then I remember the man being gone and the lifting never happening again. The one line that survived every retelling intact, word for word, the line my father used to close out every version like a door, was 4 cold words. "He's not one of us." That was the story I grew up on, and it was missing the one piece that turned out to matter most. Earl Hollis was slipping faster now. Some afternoons he was sharp as a tack, and some afternoons he drifted out on the tide and didn't come back until evening. On a sharp one, while I took his pulse, he caught my wrist with a hand like a dry leaf and held on with more strength than he had any right to. "Your grandmother came to me," he said, "before she passed. Vera. She drove herself down to the courthouse sick as she was, and she sat in my office and told me she wanted that land split even between her 2 boys. Even. She said it twice, so I'd be sure I had it right." I asked him what happened to what she wanted. His eyes filled and spilled over, and he didn't wipe them. "It didn't happen that way," he said. "Papers got signed in the weeks after that. Never should have been signed, and I'm the one who filed them. I knew better the whole time, and I filed them anyway, because Carl Thatcher was a hard man to say no to, and I was a coward in a small county." I told him to rest, that none of it had to be tonight. He shook his head against the pillow like resting was a thing he'd flat run out of. "I kept copies," he said, "all these years, in case somebody ever came along who'd do right by it." He sank back, worn through, but he held my eyes till I promised. "Come back Thursday, nurse," he said. I'll have something to put in your hands. I drove home that night with my grandmother's name going around in my head, and under it, that tune I still couldn't quite catch. I asked my Uncle Eli to walk me down the aisle on a Sunday afternoon, on his back porch, with Loretta snapping beans into a colander beside us and the cicadas going in the trees. I said it the way you say the truest things, fast, before you can talk yourself back out of it. Will you give me away? He went quiet a long time. He set his coffee down on the porch rail. Eleanor, he said finally, if I walk through the door of that church, your father is going to see a ghost come back from 30 years gone. The whole town is going to see one. I said maybe the town needed to see a ghost. Maybe a ghost was just the truth standing up where everybody could look at it. He almost smiled at that. You sure you want a ghost at your wedding, he said, instead of a father? Loretta reached over without looking up from her beans and put one hand flat on his arm. Eli, she said, in the voice of a woman who has waited a very long time for a particular door to open. The girl asked you a question. Don't make her ask it twice. He looked at his wife, and then he looked out at his own fields a while, and something 30 years old shifted behind those gray eyes. Let me think on it, he said. But I already knew. You don't tell somebody you'll think on the very thing you're going to say no to. You just say no. My mother caught me alone in the church parking lot after a planning meeting one evening. She'd driven all the way out from the farm just to find me standing there by my car in the gravel. I need to say something to you, she said, and I need you to never repeat it to anyone. I waited. In that flat lot light, she looked older than I'd ever let myself see her, every one of her 63 years sitting right there on her face. Your grandmother, she started, Vera, she wanted things a certain way, with the land, with her boys. My breath snagged in my chest. What way, Mama? I asked, soft, the way you ask a patient something they're afraid to answer. She opened her mouth, and for one long second I watched the whole truth come up and stand right there behind my mother's teeth, 40 years of it, ready to fall out into the gravel between us. Then her face eased shut, slow, like a screen door let down gentle so it won't slap. Some things are better left in the ground, she said, and she got in her car. I stood in that empty lot a long time after her taillights were gone, and I understood a thing I'd spent my whole life refusing to understand. My mother had not been cruel all those years. My mother had been afraid. She'd been afraid for 40 years, and fear that old stops looking like fear from the outside. It just starts to look like silence at the supper table. Dale came to see me himself, which he never does. He drove the whole 2 hours into the city and stood in the doorway of my apartment with his cap turning in his hands like a man come from a funeral. I hear you've been out to Eli's place, he said. I said I had. He came in but wouldn't sit, wouldn't take the coffee, just stood there in the middle of my front room filling it up. I mortgaged everything to expand this spring, he said. The bins, the scale, the new acres, second mortgage. Every dollar I've got, and a good many I don't, are in that ground. I told him I knew that. If Eli's name comes back up, he said, and his voice dropped, if anybody down at the county starts asking how the title got to be the way it is, the bank gets nervous. And a nervous bank can call a loan. The whole operation's at risk. The whole farm. I looked at him a moment. What exactly are you scared somebody's going to find, Dale? I asked. He didn't answer that. He couldn't quite meet my eye. "Just keep him away from the wedding," he said. "You bring that man back here. You're not just ending a wedding, you're ending the farm." Then he set his cap back on his head and drove 2 hours home in the dark. And I stood there and turned it over, and I noticed the one thing he'd been careful not to say. He never once said it wasn't true. He only said it would cost him if it came out. Thursday came. Earl was waiting on me, propped up against his pillows, clearer than he'd been in a week, the way some folks rally bright right at the very end. He told me to look in the bottom drawer of the bureau, underneath the winter quilts. I knelt and dug down and found a worn manila folder, gone soft as cloth from 60 years of careful hands. Inside was a copy of my grandmother's will, dated, signed, and witnessed, leaving the home place to her 2 sons in equal shares, and clipped behind it a copy of a quitclaim deed from 1996, signed by Eli in a shaky hand, signing his whole half away for almost nothing, dated just 3 weeks before Vera died, when she was already too sick to sit up. "I filed papers I knew in my bones were wrong," Earl said. "Your daddy brought Eli into my office grieving and scared and shamed, and told him this was what their mother wanted, that it kept the peace, that it was the honorable thing. It was no such thing. I had Vera's real words sitting in my own drawer the whole time he said it." His hand pressed down flat on the folder, like he was holding the years in place. "I'd like to be square with the Lord before I go, Eleanor," he said. "Your grandmother's wishes are still on record down at that courthouse. They never went anywhere. They're sitting right there in the books. Somebody just has to walk in and know to ask the right question." 3 nights later, he was gone. But the folder was already in my hands. The wedding rehearsal was the following Friday evening, in the parish hall beside the church, with the whole wedding party there and the pastor walking us through the order of things. My father came, which surprised me at first until I understood why. He came to make his point in front of an audience where it would do the most work. When the pastor asked, gentle, who would be walking the bride down the aisle, my father stood up from the folding chairs. "I've made myself clear on this matter," he said, pitched loud enough to carry to the back of the hall. "I won't be any part of it. And I'd think long and hard, Eleanor, about who you're choosing over your own flesh and blood." The pastor tried to soften it, tried to move us along. My father wasn't finished. "You want to march yourself down there with your decision," he said. "Then you walk alone. Walk alone and think about what you've done to this family." Then he crossed that hall in front of everyone, shoved open the side door and let it slap shut behind him so hard the panes rattled in the windows. The whole room sat there inside that sound. My maid of honor reached over and found my hand. Theo stood very still up at the front, watching me, not saying a word, because he knew I didn't need rescuing. I needed witnessing. My father drove off thinking the bang of that door was the last word on the whole subject. It wasn't even close to the last word. It wasn't even the right door. I want to stop right here for just a second. If you have ever had someone you love hand you a condition for their love, be this, marry that, stay quiet, keep the peace, and you have felt the floor tilt under your feet, then you already know exactly what that church hall felt like. Stay with me. What happened when those big doors finally opened is the part I waited my whole life to be able to tell out loud. Comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and let's keep going. The county seat is a 40-minute drive from the farm, and Eli drove us himself, the manila folder flat on the back seat like a thing that might wake up if we jostled it. Sandra Ortiz kept a small office over a hardware store, with a window that looked down on the courthouse square. She was maybe 50, gray at the temples, and she listened to the whole thing without once interrupting, which is how you know somebody has done this work for a long time. When Eli finished, she put on her glasses and went through the folder page by page. The quitclaim, the copy of Vera's will, Earl's shaky handwritten note about the date the deed was recorded. She did not gasp. She did not tell us we were about to be rich. She tapped the recorded deed and said the date was the part that mattered, that a transfer signed while the grantor's mother was dying, when her own will said something different, was the kind of thing a court could be asked to look at. Then she set the pages down and looked at the two of us over the top of her glasses. "Give me a week," she said. "I'll pull the recorded deed and the probate file from the courthouse myself, and I'll tell you what's really here. And until I do," she said, "you do not say one word about this to your father or your brother or anybody who shares a fence line with them." Eli nodded like a man who had waited a long time and could wait a little more. I nodded because I didn't trust my own voice yet. She called on a Thursday, 6 days later, and asked us both to come in. The probate file confirmed the rough shape of Earl's story. Vera's will, the real one, signed and witnessed 2 years before she died, divided the home place evenly between her two sons. The 1996 quitclaim that moved Eli's half to Carl had been signed in the same season Vera was failing, and the will had never been formally administered, which Sandra said was the loose thread the whole thing hung on. She was careful with her words in a way I have come to respect. She did not say we would win. She said the transfer was the kind of thing a court can reopen, that between the timing, the unadministered will, and the question of how a grown man came to sign away his birthright in the worst year of his mother's life, there was a real argument for undue influence. "Presumptively voidable," she said. "Not a sure thing." I wrote those 3 words on the back of my hand in the parking lot, so I'd stop rounding them up into a promise. Then Sandra asked Eli the question that mattered. "Do you want me to file now?" she said. "Or do you want to wait?" Eli looked out her window at the courthouse a long moment. "File it after," he said. "My niece is getting married Saturday, and I am not going to walk into that church carrying a lawsuit. I waited 30 years. The lawyers can wait 1 more week." I told one person before the wedding, and I told her by accident. Aunt Ruth caught me on the phone the next evening, asking what flowers we'd settled on, and somewhere between the centerpieces and the seating chart, my voice cracked and the whole thing came out. Earl and the folder, and Eli and Sandra Ortiz, and the 3 words on the back of my hand. Ruth was quiet for so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, in a voice I had never heard her use, that she had a cedar chest at the foot of her bed, and that inside it was every Christmas card Eli had mailed her for 30 years. 1 a year, never missed. Each one signed by Eli and Loretta, and then later by Eli and Loretta and Renee. She had kept them where Carl would never look. She said she had spent 3 decades being the sister who didn't make trouble, and she was tired of it clear down to the bone. "I have been waiting 30 years, she said, for somebody in this family to open a door instead of slamming one. Bring your uncle, Eleanor. I'll be in the second pew, and I'll stand up so fast it'll scare people." I sat down on my own kitchen floor when she said it, because for the first time, the thing I was about to do stopped feeling like a grenade and started feeling like a homecoming somebody else had been praying for too. My father, meanwhile, was working the only room he still controlled. He called the pastor twice. He called 2 men on the church board, men he'd farmed beside for 40 years, and told them his daughter was making a spectacle, dragging old family business into a house of worship, embarrassing her mother in front of the whole county. He did not say the word race to them. He never said it to anyone whose opinion he needed. He said spectacle and family business and, after everything we've done for that girl, which is a sentence that has never once been followed by a true accounting of what was actually done. Pastor Reeves called me Thursday night, gentle and tired, and told me my father had asked him to have a word with me about the tone of the day. I asked the pastor one question. "Reverend," I said, "has my father told you who he once kept out of that church, and why?" There was a silence on the line. Then the pastor said he had not asked for particulars, and that maybe it was time he did. My father, I think, expected the church to close ranks around him the way it always had. Instead, Pastor Reeves told him only, "We'll see, Carl," which is the most dangerous sentence a careful man can say to a man who is used to getting his way. The night before the rehearsal dinner, Eli came by the little rental house Theo and I had taken near the church, and the two of us sat on the back step while Theo and Loretta did dishes inside. The white oak came up the way it always did with Eli, because he had planted one just like it the spring before he left, a sapling no thicker than his thumb, down by the lane where it met the road. "Dale wants a cut now," he told me, "to make room for the new grain bin." And the surveyor stakes had it sitting right on the line of the disputed half. I said something bitter about Dale, and Eli stopped me with his hand. He said the thing I have carried with me ever since. "I never came for the land, Eleanor," he said. "I came for my brother. I spent the first 10 years angry, and the next 20 just missing him. And I would trade every acre of that place for one Sunday where Carl looked at Loretta and saw a daughter." He said the lawsuit was Sandra's business and the truth's business, but it was never his reason. And sitting there on that step in the dark, I finally understood the difference between losing a fight and refusing to have one. My uncle had refused for 30 years to become the small thing my father needed him to be. If you're still with me, do me one small favor and tap that subscribe button, because the next part is the part the whole story was built toward, and I want you here for it. Those big doors, the ones I keep telling you about, they are about to open. Let's finish this together. My mother made her last stand in the church parking lot after the rehearsal, when everyone else had driven off and it was just the two of us in the long blue Indiana dusk. She had been crying before she found me, I could tell, and she begged me. She used that word herself. "I am begging you, Eleanor," she said. "Do not bring Eli into that church tomorrow. Your father will not survive it in front of these people. If you do this, you will break this family in one afternoon, and it will be on you. You will be the one who did it." And there it was, till the oldest trick in our house, the one I had watched her work my whole life, taking the thing the man did and setting it down gently in the lap of whatever woman was standing closest. I looked at her for a long moment. I almost told her I knew about Vera's will. I almost said, "You knew. You knew the whole time, and you let him keep it." But her face was so frightened that I could see the girl she must have been 40 years ago, choosing the house over the truth, because the house was warm and the truth was cold, and she was young. So I only said, "Mama, I am not breaking this family. I am opening it. The break happened in 1996. You all just learned to walk around it." She put her hand over her mouth. "Please," she whispered through her fingers. I can't lose all of them in one afternoon. It was the truest thing she'd said to me in years, and it was still underneath a request that I be the one to keep losing instead. Earl Hollis died the night before my wedding, a little after 11, with his window cracked the way he liked it so he could hear the corn. I was not on shift, but the nurse who was knew what he had been to me, and she called, and I drove the dark county roads back out to the care home to sit with him a while before they took him. He looked smaller than the man who had handed me that folder. I held his cold hand and thanked him out loud for telling the truth at the very end of a long life spent keeping other men's secrets at the recorder's office. And then I drove back to the rental house and sat in the dark kitchen, and the doubt came for me the way it always comes, late and quiet and reasonable. I thought, what am I doing? I am about to walk into my own wedding and detonate it, to prove a point a dead man told me in a folding chair. I thought about my mother's face. I thought about the whole county turning to look. Theo came down and found me there at 2 a.m, and he did not tell me it would be fine, because he never lied to me, not once in 4 years. He just put the kettle on and sat across from me in the dark. For 1 hour, I almost called my uncle and told him to stay home. I almost gave my father the quiet wedding and the kept secret and the family that walks around the break. I had my phone in my hand. What turned me was not anger. I want to be honest about that, because anger would have been easier to explain. What turned me was a memory of being 4 years old at that same farm, the summer before Eli was gone for good, and how he had lifted me up to see a clutch of barn kittens in the loft and never once made me feel like a bother. The family had taken that man and erased him so completely that I had spent 30 years thinking the warm uncle of my childhood was something I'd half invented. He was not invented. He was robbed, and then he was hidden. And I had very nearly agreed to hide him one more day, for the comfort of people who had never once protected me the way he had, with a ladder and a litter of cats. So I did not call him to stay home. I watched the dawn come up gray and ordinary over a soybean field, and I drank Theo's tea, and when it was time, I went upstairs. My grandmother's hymnal was on the dresser where I'd set it, the one with "In the Garden" marked by a ribbon gone soft with age. I put on Vera's earrings, the little garnets my mother had passed to me without ever telling me they'd been Vera's first. I looked at myself in the mirror a long moment. Then I drove to the church. The church off Route 9 is small and white and has stood through 130 Indiana winters, and that morning it filled up the way it only does for weddings and funerals, which, in a small county, are often the same crowd in different clothes. I waited in the bride's room at the back, with Renee fixing my veil and her hands not quite steady. And through the wall I could hear the organist warming up, running her fingers through the old hymns the way organists do, and then settling, of all the songs in all the books, on "In the Garden," my grandmother's hymn. I had not asked for it. Renee went still beside me when she recognized it, and we looked at each other in the mirror, and neither of us said a word, because some things you don't dare name out loud for fear of breaking them. Out in the sanctuary, my father had arrived early in his good gray suit, and he was working the pews like a man running for office, shaking hands, accepting the soft condolences people offer the father of a bride, performing a calm he did not feel. He was certain of how this would go. He was certain I would either lose my nerve and let him walk me, his hand heavy and victorious on my arm, or that I would walk that aisle alone in front of the whole county, shamed, proving his point for him with every solitary step. Those were the only two endings he could imagine, because they were the only two he had ever left me, my whole life. The wedding coordinator put her head in the door, kind and harried, and said it was time. 2 minutes, honey, she said. I just need to know, is your father walking you, or are you going alone? Neither, I told her, and her face did a small, confused thing, and then the music swelled, and the ushers put their hands to the big double doors at the back of the sanctuary, and the doors opened. The light came in behind me first, the way it does, so that for a second the whole church saw only a shape in the doorway. And then they saw that the shape was not one person, but two. Eli stepped up beside me in a charcoal suit older than my cousin and pressed flat that morning. And he crooked his arm, and I slid my hand through it, and we stood there, one held breath in the open doorway, while a church full of people turned in their pews to see who was giving Eleanor Thatcher away. I heard the recognition move through the room like wind through a field. Row by row, the older people first. A hand went to a mouth 3 pews back. Somebody's hymnal slid off a lap and hit the floor, and under his breath, only for me, so quiet I felt it more than heard it, my Uncle Eli began to hum the hymn the organist was playing, In the Garden, my grandmother's song, the one his mother used to hum at her kitchen sink in a house he had not been allowed to enter in 30 years. We took the first step together, and from somewhere near the front, in the ringing quiet, one old man's voice said the thing the whole room was thinking. Is that Eli Thatcher? My father came up out of his pew like the floor had thrown him. He was loud in the way you are only loud when you've lost the thing that kept you quiet, and he pointed down the aisle at his own brother, and he said it, the sentence that had run under this whole family for 30 years like a buried wire. He's not one of us. He hasn't set foot in this county in 30 years. He doesn't belong in this church. He doesn't belong on that arm. Not one of us. The same 4 words he'd used on Loretta in 1996. The same 4 words he'd used on Theo at the dinner where this all began. And now, spent in public, at full volume, in front of every soul he'd ever wanted to impress. And here is the thing I had learned, the thing my whole calm life had been teaching me. I did not match him. I did not raise my voice to my father's volume, because the moment you do that, the room stops listening to what's true and starts watching 2 people fight. I let his shout hang there in the rafters and get small, and into the quiet after it, Aunt Ruth stood up in the second pew, just like she'd promised, so fast it scared the woman next to her. Then Pastor Reeves's wife stood. Then an old farmer named Whitfield, who'd known both brothers as boys. Then a whole row, then another. People standing, not in anger, but in a kind of witness, until my father was the only man left on his feet for the wrong reason, in a church full of people on their feet for the right one. I looked at him down that long aisle, and I kept my voice low enough that the room had to lean in to catch it. You told me to walk alone, Dad, I said, and think about what I'd done. I thought about it, and I decided not to. Pastor Reeves is not a young man, and he has buried and married half the county, and he read that room in about 4 seconds, the way only an old shepherd can. He did not call for order. He did not ask my father to sit, and he did not ask him to leave. He simply lifted both hands, the way he does over a christening, and said, in a voice that filled the room without ever rising, "Friends, we are here this morning to witness a marriage. Shall we continue?" And the room, still standing, said yes, in that low collective murmur that is more powerful than any shout, and they sat. And Eli walked me the rest of the way down the aisle, while the organist, bless her, played my grandmother's hymn all the way to the front. He placed my hand in Theo's. He did not glare at my father as he passed him. He just gave Theo's shoulder one squeeze, the way an uncle does, and stepped into the front pew beside Loretta and Renee and Ruth. My mother sat one section over, frozen exactly between the husband still standing and the daughter at the altar, belonging fully to neither, which is the country a person ends up in after 40 years of silence. Theo took both my hands. The vows we had written were plain ones, and just before we said them, he leaned in, only for me, and said the truest small thing anybody said all day. Your grandmother would have liked the music. The reception was in the church parlor, sheet cake and coffee urns and folding tables, the way weddings are done out here. And my father did not have the sense or the grace to go home. He found Eli by the coffee, with a knot of the old men around them, the ones who remembered, and he made his last play in front of all of them. You came back for the land, he said. 30 years, and you show up the minute there's a wedding and a chance to make a grab for the home place. That's what this is. That's all this ever was. And the parlor went quiet, because it was, at last, the real question, the one under everything. I had the manila folder in my bag. I had carried it all day without quite knowing why, and I took it out, and I did not wave it or slap it down or read from it like a lawyer on television. I just set it flat on the table between them, the recorded deed and Vera's true will and Sandra Ortiz's careful notes, and I left my hand resting on top of it a moment, and I let it sit there being a fact. My uncle looked at the folder, and then he looked at his brother, and he said it the way he'd said it to me on that back step, except now the whole room got to hear the truth of him. I never came for the land, Carl. I came for her. He nodded at me. For her. And for any of these kids who ever got told they weren't one of us. And across the parlor, my brother Dale went the color of skim milk, because Dale alone understood exactly what was in that folder and what an unadministered will and a clouded title would do to the second mortgage he'd signed against land that had never cleanly been ours to borrow against. I watched him set his coffee down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to shake and you don't want anybody to see. Old man Whitfield, who had stood up in the church, looked from the folder to my father and back, and said only, in the flat way old farmers say the thing that ends an argument, Carl, is that Vera's will? My father didn't answer him. He looked at the folder on the table the way you look at a dog you were sure was dead. For the first time in my life, my father stood in a room full of people who had known him 40 years, and he did not have a single line. He opened his mouth once and shut it. And what I felt watching him was not triumph. It was the strange, flat quiet of watching a thing that has loomed over your whole childhood turn out, in the end, to be just a frightened man beside a coffee urn. Sandra Ortiz filed on Monday morning, the way she'd said she would, a petition to reopen the administration of my grandmother's estate and to set aside the 1996 transfer. I will tell you plainly that it is not finished, because real things do not finish the way stories do. Presumptively voidable, not a sure thing, those were still the words, but a clouded title is a clouded title from the day it's challenged. And within a few weeks, once the title company picked up the recorded challenge, the bank quietly froze the undrawn portion of Dale's expansion loan, pending the question of who actually owned the ground the new bin was going on. My father kept the land for 30 years by making sure nobody ever asked the right question in front of the right people. He could not survive 30 minutes of the right question asked out loud in a church. The community did the thing communities do, slowly and without announcement, which is reorder itself around a truth once it can no longer be unseen. People who'd nodded at Carl in the feed store started nodding a little less. And my mother's 40 years of silence, the silence she'd spent to keep her house warm and her marriage whole, finally came due, all at once, with interest, in a single Saturday afternoon. My father kept the land for 30 years. He could not keep the room for 30 minutes. A few weeks after the wedding, we all gathered at Eli and Loretta's place, 2 counties over, a low brick house with a deep porch and a lane lined in oaks. Eli, Loretta, Renee, Aunt Ruth, Theo, and me. Ruth brought the cedar chest of Christmas cards, and we read some of them out loud on the porch and laughed, and a couple of us cried. And down by the lane, the white oak Eli had planted as a boy at the home place had a cousin here, a big one, decades in the ground, because of course the man had planted another the first spring he had land of his own to plant it in. It stands. Whatever the court finally says about the acres back in Merrill County, that tree stands. And the one at the home place sits on the half the deed says was always Eli's. And Dale's grain bin will have to find another spot. When we went inside for supper, Eli held the screen door, the same kind of spring-hinged screen door I'd grown up flinching at, and he held it for every one of us. And he did not let it slap. He held it until the last person was through. In this house, he said, the door waits for everybody. I have thought a lot since that day about my father standing alone in that church while the room rose around me, and about what the word us is actually made of. He thought it was made of blood and land and who'd been here longest. He spent his whole life guarding a fence line. But the county decided, in about a minute and a half on a Saturday morning, that us was made of who shows up and who holds the door. And they decided it without taking a vote, just by standing. Family, it turns out, is not the people who share your name and your dirt. Family is the door you choose to hold open, and the people who walk through it toward you when somebody else has told them to stay out. My father told me to walk alone. Instead, the whole church taught him what the word us was always going to mean. If this story moved you, the kindest thing you can do is stay a moment longer and tell me in the comments about the door someone once held open for you. Like this video so it finds the next person who needs it, and subscribe because I have another true-to-life story like this one ready for you next week. Thank you for walking with me all the way to the end.